Hi, I'm Sean McLean, and welcome to my YouTube channel. If this is your first time visiting my channel, my goal here is to kind of go over the processes and things I discovered during my year-long process of writing and publishing self-publishing my debut novel, The Devil in the Blue, which is available at Amazon. So a few days ago, I did a video on the editing cost of my novel. And I received a few comments, and one of them was an interesting comment, not about the editing, but about the cover to my novel. And it was two parts to the message. There was one half. The first part was about just the cover itself in terms of whether it fits the genre or type. And the second part of the comment was, I'm not going to go to talk about that one, but it was more about just, I guess, whether just generally about the cover. But the first part about whether the cover fit the genre that I was talking about, or that the book is supposed to be in, I think that was a fair comment. I think it was a reasonable question, and it had me thinking more about covers in general. So I've always thought about covers sort of as a secondary thing until I saw this comment. Even when I was publishing the book, I didn't really concentrate that much on the covers, but now it seems like, and this is part of the comment that was in my YouTube video, was the book cover is the first thing that sells your book. If you don't have a book cover, you're not going to sell your book. And that seems to be the modern mantra. And that seems to be also the overwhelming majority of opinions, is you have to have a perfect cover that fits your genre. If you don't have that, you're not going to sell your book. I really can't verify if that's true or not. I mean, it seems to be the consensus. So for me personally, I disagree with that proposition. Again, personally, I have never bought a book. I certainly never bought a book only because of the cover. And I can't recall ever buying a book because of the cover, even as part of the formula at all. I do find them interesting and beautiful in some ways. But usually for me, books have been sold, or to me, as a review. A friend recommends it, my spouse, a family member, a teacher, somebody would recommend the book, or I would read a review. And if I did that, then I'd be interested in reading the book. And if the cover was nice, I might like it and find it, intriguing or beautiful in some ways. But I wouldn't buy the book. I wouldn't buy the book because of that. What's that? The old adage, don't judge a book by its cover. I think that's true. I think you can have a book cover that's fantastic and alluring, but the book's okay, or actually could be frankly bad, but it has a great cover. So therefore you sold your book. So I disagree with that proposition. So the title of this video is, The Death of the Book Cover and the Rise of the Algorithmic Design. And what I mean by the algorithmic design is, I think this is what I think the person meant in the comment was, if you have a thriller, you have to have a dark cover, dark and gritty. If you have a romance, or a beach read, you need pastels and pinks, which I do have some of that in my cover, admittedly. And then you have, or fantasy, which could be golds and some darks and crowns and thorns or whatever it is. That is what I mean by the algorithmic design. It's designed to catch your eye on a web page, for example, on Amazon or whatever it is. You look at that screen and you see there's a list of books, and admittedly, you have a lot to choose from, and it could be paralyzing in a way, and the book cover can work. But I think there's something that is doing a disservice not only to the author, but to the public. So my plan for this video is I'm going to break it into two parts. I want to start with a set of book covers, and then talk about kind of where I think they fall in the spectrum of fanciful, which is maybe purely artistic, versus as you move towards descriptive, where you can telegraph what the book's about and the reader knows. And I do have two authors I picked out separately that I want to talk about, because I was able to find more history on them, and the authors had a lot more input and opinions on that I could see anyway on the cover. I'm not saying the other authors of the other books don't. I just was able to find data on these two authors. And then the second half of the video, the shorter portion of the video, will be talking about my thought process on my book cover design and what I was thinking, and what I hope that others will see. So I'm going to start with this stack, and it's not as bad as it looks. Two of the books are the David Foster Wallace editions of Infinite Jest, which is a third of the pile. So I'm going to start with a book cover that I think, and you can do this exercise with, there's probably dozens or hundreds, thousands of books you could pick out for this. I happened to pick some that I tried to fit the range of, again, fanciful to descriptive. So I'm going to start with descriptive. And, this is Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. And like the title says, Memoirs of a Geisha, it's about a geisha. And the picture is of a geisha. So I think, and again, there's many things in here that you could call, I use the word dark, but troubling. There's war, and there's the young geishas involved. But again, the basic premise is you're not surprised by this cover. It's not like something you don't know. You don't even look at the back of the blurb to know it's about a geisha. So I call that descriptive. It's attractive. Is it really bright? Maybe not, but the pinks are nice on the gray. Oh, and let me also add, I'm not an artist or a critic. I just, I've always found them interesting, like I said, but I spent more time on them trying to figure the covers out when I was working on mine. So they're just my opinions. I'm not an expert in any way. Another cover that I think you could maybe call descriptive, but it has a lot of color to it, is Fahrenheit 451. And I say descriptive because there's flames in it and a man in a uniform. I think that's his mask. But that's sort of a blend in between colors and brightness. But you can tell it's about a fire and the flame, other than the title too. But the flames in the uniform do give away a lot of what the genre probably is. If you use that word, it's it's a science fiction, and it sort of has a scientific flair, I think. So now I want to talk about two, I guess I would use the word more fanciful books, and they're also representative of these two covers I'm going to go over, is because I think in the 50s and 60s, book covers started to get more color. It might have just been from the era, but I think post World War II, the death toll and destruction and what it did to Europe and to the United States to a lesser degree was a shocking period. And I think the book covers coming out of the 50s and 60s started getting more, I use the word visceral. They were more visceral, I think, too, but also they were just more colorful. So some of the, I think, is the era of these covers, but there's more than that, I think, and I want to explain that here. So the first one is Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So again, there's the movie, and it's I think a masterpiece too. But there's some things you can argue that are funny in the book, but a lot of the book is not funny. I mean, it's in a mental institution; people are mentally ill. It's dark, yet the book cover is, you got some dark in there, but it's kind of bright and it's very 60s. I don't think you can glean that it's necessarily in a category, which I think is good, because I think it doesn't. I think that this book exceeds categories, and to put it into a genre, maybe other than literary, I think would be a disservice. And so I think the cover matches the idea that it doesn't need to be pigeonholed, right? It could be anything you want it to be, but you need to read the book to form your own opinion and not just use the cover. So the next one I want to talk about is Catch-22. And this is the original cover design, not with the Hulu and the 50th anniversary. These two tokens or whatever, I think, ruined the cover. I wish it wasn't there, but I can't get them off. They're part of the design. So this is the original design. And if you recall, this, if you read this book, there's funny things in the book, and you can say, well, it's a puppet dancing person and it's light blue. But for all the comedy, it is a very dark and terrifying book, and a look at psychological damage and more. So to me, while it's funny, it's terrifying at the same time, and it gets even bloody. You wouldn't guess that from the cover. Now, although it does have some torn paper, which makes it look like maybe that could be something's damaged. But I do want to point out something here too, in terms of descriptiveness. When people see the name Catch-22, they could think, oh, that's a descriptive title. It tells you that's what the book's about. But I actually think it's 100% fanciful. And the reason why is this edition happens to have like a 50 or 60 pages of an appendix that has a history of the book, some letters even from Joseph Heller. And this phrase, Catch-22, did not exist. Joseph Heller coined that term. It didn't exist until then. So now some people, I think even back then in the 60s when this book came out, thought that Catch-22 after the name took over, maybe 10 years later, but maybe years later, the name Catch-22 sort of took over a life of its own. And people thought, maybe as they do now, that catch-22, that the book's about catch-22. So it'd be the most descriptive title you could have. But it's not. It's 100% fanciful because it didn't exist. So between that and the color, you wouldn't know that it's a terrifying war novel. I don't think there's any way really to know that. And I think that's important because I think that's where artistic design has moved away from fanciful and artistic to flat out, this is your genre, this is what you print, or you can't sell or I can't market your book for you. The next two, I picked these two because I happen to have two different editions of the same book. So the first one, this is the original Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace. And again, I'm not an art critic, but I see the blue cover in the sky with the clouds. I don't exactly sure what that's supposed to portend, but it's a clear-minded vision staring at the sky, peaceful. But the book is not about peace and staring at the sky. It's about entertainment and I think addiction and some very unhappy people. And you wouldn't necessarily glean that from this. And there's no pictures on there. There's a picture, but there's no people or anything to really figure out what it's about, because I think that's important. You need to figure that out on your own. And then in contrast, the 20th year anniversary, so I guess in the 2010s, was the second edition. The original was gloss, and this is matte, all white, except for the red lettering, in a TV box with an eye in the middle. I think that's more descriptive. I think because it's entertainment in the TV box and people staring at it, or well, this sort of has 1984 look to it, but people, they're staring at a TV and it's their whole existence, and it takes up all their eye space. So that's maybe a little bit more descriptive, I think, than the original. Again, that could be because of time. As people, I think we are moving towards these very descriptive, narrow categories of genres, and this is a very watered attempt at that, but it is more specific, I think, than the original. Although it is matte, which I think is a little more attractive. So after having done those, I picked the last two authors with a few books that I think are critical, because they actually provide a kind of a history and an insight into how the authors think about covers. So the first one I want to talk about is Cormac McCarthy. And I'll start with Blood Meridian. And there's a reason for this. So, we know that Cormac McCarthy was reclusive, and I thought, well, he just didn't want to have anything to do with the commercial side of the business. He wanted to write and publish. But he actually did have a lot of insight into his book covers, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But on this cover, it looks like it's the sun setting maybe, or it's the west, and there's wheat fields, I think. It's orange and red. It's attractive. But I don't think anyone will look at that, not knowing the story, and realize that it's actually one of the bloodiest, goriest books, I think, written in America, maybe in any country. And I mean, it's so horrifically violent. I had trouble starting the book. I had to put it down and start over again just to get my mind around the level of violence. And I actually, as a writer, which I'll get to my book in a moment, as a writer, I understand violence as a character, violence as something to describe either any time, but describe human beings. To ignore violence in life is to ignore being a human being. Human beings are inherently violent. So that doesn't bother me at all. It's just, I find fascinating that the cover doesn't really suggest that it's violent in that way. And then even the back is Cormac McCarthy sitting in his study with his books. Now he's looking down, pensive. So maybe he's mulling over life in this book. But in my opinion, it's still an intelligent design. It doesn't tell you that it's a blood book about scalping people and selling the scalps as they make their way across America. Make their way across the West. So again, that to me it's an artistic cover that doesn't tell the story. So the next two I want to bring up is The Road, if you can see that. This is, I was able to actually find some interesting, I want to use the word anecdotal. It might be, but I think it seemed accurate to me, at least the story about it, that the designer, Chip Kidd, who I think is a famous designer, had a design. I don't know if it looked like this originally, but Cormac McCarthy actually had very express instructions that I read on the internet. Is he wanted the book cover to be almost blank. And like I think he had, what I understood was Cormac McCarthy wanted a church or a barn or something, a barn I think, abandoned on its side, and that wrapped around the cover. But the cover was supposed to be blank, no name, no title, only on the spine of the book. And apparently, I think what I understood reading was, while Kidd thought that was insightful or brave, I think the marketing team thought it was recklessly counterproductive. I think that was the word or the words, and that was just not going to happen. And I can sort of understand that, but I mean, actually, when I first read that, I was actually fascinated, thinking I'd love to see a book actually be fascinating, have a book that was like this, just black, and then you just had the title, the spine. But what's fascinating was Cormac McCarthy didn't want to be, what I read was, to be put into a genre. Any of his books, I think, what I understood is any of these, Blood Meridian, The Road, and we're going to talk about No Country for Old Men, not to be pigeonholed into a genre. And I think when you have the cover that is too descriptive, or something tips you off to what the book is about or what the genre is in it, then I think you either lose the reader or you're pandering, perhaps. So I appreciate actually learning that he had a lot of insight into his covers and wanted to not be stereotyped or be put into a genre. So, and on this cover, I think the original, what I saw was that the colors were reversed. Like the robe was copper or red, and his name was white. And I guess they inverted it. I don't know if that makes any difference or not, but this is a nice looking cover. I do think I did see a movie trailer cover, like with Viggo Mortensen on the cover. And again, I think movie cover titles are ugly. I think I have never seen a movie cover edition of a book that I've liked ever. I think they're ugly, and they ruin it. They take away from the book. Not only do they tell you to go see the movie instead, I think they're intimating that. But I had not seen The Road, but I love the book. But I think they do that and they ruin it. So I would be surprised if Cormac McCarthy would have agreed or liked that cover of the movie. But anyway, that's kind of the story behind that one. And the next one, the last of the series for Cormac on the covers, is this is the movie. Speaking of movie cover, No Country for Old Men. This has the movie cover on it, and this is interesting because I did look at this original. I don't have, unfortunately, all I have is the movie cover. The original, I think, what I saw was a kind of a red, very intense red, maybe like a sunset, or in I guess with a sunset maybe, or a very blinding light with a dark silhouette that I think is the protagonist. But just looking at that cover, which was attractive, other than the intensity of the color, which I think suggests something, that you wouldn't understand or contemplate the blood and the violence in this book. But I think when I look at this cover and I see Anton Chigurh, Llewellyn Moss with a gun in a satchel in his hand running, I guess that's what the movie's about, is running and getting chased by that monster. And again, I think it puts it into a genre. Now, if I had to choose, I would probably have to put that in a category of a thriller. Although I think it's got a lot of psychological insight and philosophical insights that it doesn't get credit for because of things like that. So that's an example where I think Cormac would look at that and say, well, the book's a lot more than just a movie title. But again, some people like that, and I think it probably sells. So the last book I want to go over in the samples is Lolita. And this is the only copy I have. So I was fascinated by Lolita because, like Blood Meridian, Lolita, there's a lot of heated discussions or disputes, fights maybe, about Lolita. Is it, people can see many different types of stories in Lolita. And I think there's probably fair ways to look at it in more than one way. But I want to say, if I use that with the cover, I want to say this. This cover, I think, is highly suggestive of a particular view of the book. So clearly it's, I think, a young girl, because there's not a blemish on her face, not a mark. Her lips are full and they're pink. I mean, she looks very young. But that tells you that side of the story only. I think most people will pick that cover up and say, oh, I know that. I've heard about Lolita, and now I know what it's about. And it's fascinating, though, because I will say it does have a young girl in the story, obviously. But also because it's so zoomed in on her, I think it does sort of artistically suggest the obsession of the protagonist with Lolita. So I do find that fascinating because it does intimate something artistically that you wouldn't necessarily know. It's like, I'm not complaining about that. I think it's it's a good cover. But more importantly, on Lolita, I was curious about what Nabokov, like Cormac McCarthy, whether he was interested in book covers. So I researched on the internet, of course, whether there was different covers for Lolita and what Nabokov thought. And it was fascinating. I'll put the link in the description to this website. It actually shows 60 different covers for Lolita. And you can see, this one's in there too. But the original cover was this plain avocado green cloth bound book that just said Lolita with the author's name. And that was the version that I understood, what I read was Nabokov wanted. He didn't want to have, fascinatingly, didn't want to have the word, a picture of the girl, a girl, on the cover. So for him, he wanted a plain cover. I think the one I did read that he wanted like a winding road and some clouds, I think I might have read, but he certainly didn't want to have girls in the picture or young girls. But that's actually what most of the covers have. It's about Lolita. And I'm not saying that's bad. It's just those covers that, and this website's fascinating because some are just flat, they're either obscene or bad. And there's several movie cover ones, and those actually, again, in my opinion, are the worst. But some of them, they're subtle, and I think they give you different views of how you should read the book. But I think this is probably leans more towards one view, and then some other ones are more about the protagonist and there's a man in the cover. So I think those, or maybe that's to the other extreme. But I think there is a middle ground that I think some of the covers do. But the bigger point is the titles, the covers change over time, and they also depend on the person's perspective at that moment, or who's producing the book. And maybe that sells better. Maybe someone who has a certain view wants to buy Lolita for that view, so they buy that cover. So I wanted to clarify too, I'm not naive. I do understand that people, including myself, need to sell books. And if you have the right title, the right cover, including title, I guess, and the right picture or photograph and the right angle, and that helps sell books, then I guess that's what has to get done. So now I want to move on to my book. So like I said in the beginning of the video, the comment was, my book cover didn't seem to fit a thriller, which is, I think I did use that word, to be fair. But I only used it because I think a lot of places, they require you, websites, whatever, you have to have a genre, sometimes even a subgenre. And so I picked thriller because there is violence in the book and action. There is thriller and psychological suspense. But I had pondered maybe having a different kind of cover that maybe was more obvious that it was a thriller or gritty. But to me, I didn't want to be pushed into a category or a genre necessarily by the cover. And I'm not saying I'm Cormac McCarthy. I'm not saying that. I am just saying, for me, the neo-noir was a concept that seemed to fit the book. The colors and things were a throwback. I guess I would say a twist on noir films of the 40s and 50s are black and white. So I wanted something bright to contrast against that, because this is neo-noir, because the characters aren't necessarily the same as they were 60, 70, 80 years ago now, of those characters. So people are, I think there's more gray, there's more moral ambiguity. And I think having the different color cover, I think, suggests, well, it's not your standard thriller. At least that's how I intended it and how I tried to write the book. And again, it's Las Vegas, because that's part of the story, is Las Vegas. It is more vintage, I would agree. It's not necessarily a current photograph of Las Vegas or what it would look like. It is vintage. But again, that was more of maybe an homage or a throwback to the Las Vegas in the 40s and 50s. And so I did try to have, again, there's some modern elements in the cover too that I think are more current day. But again, the general motif was to try to telegraph that, well, this is, it's a neo-noir. It's not a current market day thriller that fits into a specific genre. So there's some risk associated with that, probably. For me, I'm self-published, so it was up to me to decide what I want to look like, what I want people to think. Is it a detriment? It could be. I think if I set this against different thrillers, I'll use this one. If I had to put in a category, if I had that, you might question it, saying, well, that's a darker cover. It telegraphs more. That could be. And I think if I was set against many other thrillers, modern day, it probably would be considered too bright, too pink, maybe summery. But I want the reader to decide what the book is like, not necessarily me absolutely telling them this is a dark, gritty thriller, and this is how you need to think. So that's the video for today. If you have any, I'd be interested in your opinions on not just these covers I talked about or my cover, but some other covers that you have, some anecdotes you might have. I'd be glad to read those in the comments. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, of course. Before I forget, so this Sunday there is a launch of 100 free ebook copies on Goodreads. I'll put a link in the description to my author's page. And again, that's the releases on Sunday for 100 free copies of my novel, of the ebook. Well, again, thank you for your time.